Kia ora, everybody. I'm having the great pleasure of speaking with Zach Bitter. You might remember back early 2018, we had Sean Baker on, and Zach Bitter is the other half of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. You can see there, no, you probably can't because it's audio, but he's got a green screen set up, and when we flashed up, he had the Human Performance Outliers coming up on our little Zoom conference here, mate. I always start off with, what did you do last weekend? Because generally, for those of us out there that don't do their passion full time, it's what we sort of try and explore and get into on the weekend. But what did you get up to last weekend, brother?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I cut off for a second there. What did you say?
What did you get up to last weekend?
Last weekend?
Yeah.
Last weekend, what was I doing? Oh, you know what? I was actually in Chicago doing helping out with there's a conference there, a medical conference it was the American College of Sports Medicine, and I went out there with my employer, Ultra Footwear, to talk to some of the trainers, doctors, physicians, and things like that about foot health. So that was kind of cool.
Magnificent. So in Australia, which is where I'm based at the moment, there's a podiatrist called Barefoot Podiatrist, and he's big on low drop shoes and things like that. What are you guys offering in that sort of form, and especially for you that runs a long way? Where do you think that fits in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I the shoe I wear, Ultra, they make a variety of different models, and their approach is maybe a little different than the minimalist movement that we kind of saw catch a little bit of momentum a few years ago. But they're very much a natural footwear. And what they do is they look at making a shoe that is like anatomically appropriate to the way your foot is shaped, as opposed to kind of having that toe box taper in, which ironically enough is just echoes of previous generations for horseback riding, I guess. The reason shoes are as pointy as they are was because in a less than ideal situation, if you fall off your horse, you don't want your shoe to be stuck in there and get drug along. So they had those nice pointy boots so that you could slide it right out if that would happen, and probably just for getting on and off a lot easier. And we didn't manage to change that until pretty recent, actually. So the foot-shaped toe box thing is kind of one of the bigger features for that. But then also, like you were mentioning, that low drop, and all the Ultra shoes are built on what we call a zero drop platform. And where it verges a bit from true minimalism is it's zero drop with cushioning. So you're on that flat platform, but you're not necessarily just like a slab of rubber like you're going to see like in a Vibram 5-finger type of shoe or something like that. But I do like the lower profile stuff, the lower cushion stuff for the most part. So I ended up gravitating a little further to those products in the line than say the max cushion versions of it. But they all seem to find a purpose, and when you work for the company, you can use them all. So you find yourself with just a quiver of shoes.
Nice. And how did you sort of go from that traditional shoe into something a bit more, I suppose, anatomically correct now, I guess, maybe?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, because I think like what I saw anyway was when the minimalist movement first kind of gained a lot of momentum, we saw a lot of times is people, they looked at the idea or the concept and like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So they went and threw away their classic running shoes and threw on a pair of true minimalist shoes and found out that, there's muscles and things in your lower legs. and when you kind of do a drastic switch to something that is not super supportive or minimal, you're going to work those muscles a lot differently. So a lot of people, I think they got out the gate a little too hot and wound up picking up some injuries and things like that. And then the whole minimalist movement had a little bit of a backlash for that. But fortunately for me, I looked into it in quite a bit of detail before I started it. So I kind of transitioned down. So I went from a traditional running shoe that at the time, most running shoes were built on what they would call a 24-12 offset, where the heel was 24 millimeters off the ground and the forefoot was about 12 millimeters. And then it would always be built on, a cushioned bed. So what I did is I started kind of weaning myself down. I started out in a semi-cushioned, like 6 millimeter offset, and then worked down to 4, and then eventually 0. And then I went from, 0 to just 0 and minimalist. So I've even done a fair bit of minimalist running in my past just to kind of get those lower leg muscles and everything kind of back up to speed. And That process as a whole was probably about 6 months from just a traditional running shoe down into a true minimalist shoe. That was kind of before I was wearing Ultra footwear exclusively. Ultra footwear is a little different. Like I was saying before, they kind of have entry options where you can go from a typical traditional running shoe into one of theirs and not have this big transition phase. And then if you want to keep working your way down, you can kind of just step down in different shoes in their lineup and get down to something like one of my favorite shoes they have is called the Vanish, and it's just like a 3.9 ounce road racing flat essentially. So yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, people I think sometimes think like, oh, you can't run barefoot, or you can't run with just a thin slab of rubber under your foot. And I've done 100 milers in shoes like that before, so you can. And the most interesting story I have about that is I showed up to a race probably about a year and a half ago once, and I had the pair of Vanish on, that 3.9 ounce shoe. And I was like, there's just no way anyone here is going to have that shoe on the foot than me. And I ended up fourth on the list that day because there were 3 guys who ran completely barefoot.
Nice. And that movement is in New Zealand. I lined up for 12K around the bridges in Hamilton 2 years ago, and there's a few barefoot runners on the road and footpaths as well. So I was like, man, they must have some tough feet. I think it's really ironic because, like, as kids, and especially in New Zealand, lots of like the rugby competitions will start off with kids just playing in barefoot, and when you go to athletics day, you sort of, even if you're lucky enough to have a track, you'll sort of find your way to run barefoot when it comes to the middle distance. Like plenty of us running around in socks and putting holes in them, and or sending them home covered in red for our parents to clean. And then all of a sudden, like a lot of things, common knowledge comes in, and you're wearing this massive padded shoe. And I don't know why, but when I was playing volleyball at school, I had these cheap pair of shoes with no bottom on them, and played volleyball for a while, but ended up with a stress fracture just probably because it wasn't used to it. Like I said, all of these little muscles that support the foot. And I guess this is probably what you guys get at with the Human Performance Outliers podcast. There's so many contradictions out there, and the black swans out in the world are probably what should be getting us asking questions. How did you get on at a conference in what did you say, sports medicine, when you're showing up a low carb athlete wearing shoes that have not much to it?
No, it's interesting. I think a lot of that side of things is coming around now too, as the science kind of catches up, I think. And usually what I tell folks with the footwear stuff, to me that's a pretty easy sell, because if you're talking to an exercise phys person or someone who's got a background knowledge and that sort of stuff, they know how the Achilles tendon is supposed to function, and they know how, like, when you power off with your foot, how the power is supposed to be generated through your big toe. So if you're starting to compromise those 2 parts of your body, you're going to compromise your performance to some degree. So selling it to them or pitching it to them, that makes sense. And then it just becomes an education process of like, well, how do we get people from essentially a big old cast on their foot down to something that's a little more versatile in how their foot moves. The nutrition stuff is maybe a little more of an uphill battle. And I don't know if I'd call it an uphill battle as much as I think the biggest thing with that is always like context. So, I'll get looped into conversations all the time where it's like low carb for performance or low carb for endurance. And then it'll either be like, is it good or bad, or, no, like all black and white. and my first thought is like, well, endurance is such a kind of wide sweeping term. It's like, what are we talking about with endurance? Are we talking about a 3-kilometer steeplechase race, or are we talking about a 24-hour event? Because I think you're working a lot differently with that stuff. And there's certainly some commonalities, I think, with any kind of periodized structured endurance training program. You're going to do an awful lot of aerobic work, and that aerobic work is ideal to be burning fat at. So you can still, I think, do some form of a high fat, low carb diet, regardless of what endurance distance you're doing. You might just have to formulate it a little differently depending on, whether you're preparing for the Olympic 5 kilometers or if you're out there trying to run 100 miles in the mountains or something like that. So usually when you start breaking it down like that, you can make a little more sense of it for folks, but it's still a confusing topic, I think.
Mate, time flies because when we jacked up that we were going to do this today, I thought I'd better go back and listen to that interview you did with Joe Rogan, and turns out it was last year. But on there, you brought up the names of Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek. How did they enter your sphere?
Yeah, so they were one of my first points of contact when I kind of started following a high-fat, low-carb diet. It was kind of the end of 2011, and I think the first time I really came across it was through, if I had to guess, it was maybe Ben Greenfield's podcast or Endurance Planet or something like that. But that sent me kind of down a rabbit hole of investigating, and I would listen to all these podcasts that were talking about it, and then ultimately, like, you go check out the research they were citing or the books they were talking about, and Jeff Volek and Steve Finney's they have a couple books. One is for like low carbohydrate living, and one's a little more performance based. So I immediately got both of those and read them right away, and that's when I kind of started to implement it. So there was a few key figures kind of in that area around then that I definitely gleaned a lot of info from, and Finney and Volek were definitely two of them. So been lucky to meet both those guys and talk to them, and actually participate in a research study with Dr. Volek at one point back in 2014.
Nice. And one of the guests or a couple of guests on this podcast, Grant Schofield and Karen's, and is their book, What the Fat for Performance, come across your table, or is that something that...
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. I haven't ever had any dialogue with either of them though. So, yeah, I think, I think where a lot of times things get muddied is with, like what I was saying before, with the whole context of the situation, and you get these, these guys and gals who are essentially training for a job at a distance that's what I would call kind of a gray area in terms of what the human body is really good at. And that's kind of that, like 5K to marathon distance. So, that's where you run into some of these situations where, carbohydrate for performance is certainly something that I wouldn't necessarily argue against in that specific context. But then you start getting into real life situations with folks who are, working a 9-to-5 job, and, they're trying to manage what they're doing with health and all this other stuff. And then it becomes more about a nutrition plan, I think, that is going to be sustainable for them to get where they want to be. And I think a lot of times a high fat, low carb type of diet can fit nicely into something like that.
Magnificent. So what do you think is the difference from when you're sort of working in education to running as your sort of role in life? What do you think you're able to achieve more of?
Yeah, it's always interesting because when I was a teacher for about 5 years in the Midwest in Wisconsin, and I actually had my dream job right before I quit. Like, I was working at this place called Clark Street Community School, and it was like a project-based high school essentially, and it was really driven around the students' interests, which I really think is the way education should start going, mainly just because when I think of my personal high school experience and even my collegiate experience, the big takeaways are these fundamental skills I learned, not necessarily the like really minute details or memorization type stuff. So I think if you can tie those fundamental skills to something that's interesting to a student, especially in that kind of high school age, you're just going to get a lot more value out of that. And so that was a hard gig to leave, because it was kind of the spot I had always wanted to be. And then I was there. But, it's also one of those things where when you're a teacher, you have a lot of flexibility in the summers. You have your weekends and holidays off. But when you're at school, and it's really tough to really break away without digging yourself into a hole down the road with extra work, or just, you're feeling like you're not completely doing the job to the level that you should be. So, a lot of times races and things are going to be, scattered throughout the year. So doing what I do now offers me that flexibility to kind of be able to race year round whenever I want, because I can control my schedule a little better. And I still fancy myself as a teacher, just not in the same capacity. I'm just educating adults, I guess, more with running related things or foot mechanics, I guess, and sometimes nutrition.
Yeah, and the podcast is real quality. So with your schedule now, are you sort of showing up to an event and doing some work with Ultra, or does that come first or after, or how does that all how do you package that up?
Yeah, it depends a little bit. Sometimes like I think I'm always kind of an advocate for them in some shape or form. Just, working for them gives me the advantage of kind of just knowing a lot about the company and all the ins and outs and all the educational material tied to it. So, I can be a very good spokesperson for them. So if I'm at a race that is just a passion of mine and, people want to know about it, I'm more than willing to share. But, there's a fairly good variety of things too, where sometimes I've got a goal race where I'm really trying to peak for, where that's the primary focus. I'm there to go there and push as hard as I can. And then there's other races too that are just a little that are, I would call like kind of a B race or a training race, where I'm not going to try to destroy myself, because I'm going to try to get back into training fairly quickly after that, en route to a different event down the road. And those ones I think are really easy to kind of incorporate a more holistic approach, where I can advocate for or do some work for Ultra before and after and still do the race and not feel like it's at a compromise to either one of those two things.
Question I had from listening to that podcast was, what are your feedbacks to, especially when it comes to those B races where you've sort of got a time frame or a pattern involved? What are your sort of feedback mechanisms to go, I'm on track for doing this goal?
Yeah. So, whenever I go to a race that's not one I'm peaking for, and the way I describe a peak race for ultra marathons is I think you can maybe get away with 2 or 3 of those a year. And I mean, that's assuming that they go well and you really are able to put your body through the gauntlet. It's just when I've had races like that in the past, it's just a lot clearer afterwards that you're going to need a little more time to kind of bounce back and then just get in the right headspace to even take on another training plan. So those B races, I think those are where it gets a little tricky. I hold myself accountable on those, and I tell myself I cannot surpass about 80% of my full capacity at those, just because I know, I want to maybe take a day off after this if it's really long or something that is a key workout. But other than that, I'm going to try to get back into training within a few days and not want to have to end up kind of just slogging through what we call junk miles, I guess, for 2 weeks after that, and then end up losing potential gain in training because I did this event a little harder than I should have. So that's kind of the headspace I'm in. I think I like it still, though, because it allows you the opportunity to kind of go through the paces of what you would at an A race, from the getting ready the night before, getting a good night's sleep in before the race, and just all the routines that you're going to do before an event. You can kind of practice those. And it also kind of offers up a good opportunity to work on whatever fueling strategy you're going to use during your key race, just to kind of make sure everything is working the same way as it did last time. And then, for me, from another end of things, it's like long runs and ultra marathons tend to be, a pretty big time commitment, and can be a logistical battle too, if you're out there trying to find your own water or fuel or things like that during a long run that you're planned on your own. Whereas you show up to a race and it's all kind of taken care of. Like, they got the starting line, they got the route mapped out, they've got the course marked, they got aid stations every 5 miles or so, or 8 kilometers. So it's just I'm spoiled here too in Arizona, where we've got one of the biggest ultra marathon running race organizations, and I think in the world probably. It's called Aravaipa, and they put on I think it's 34 different ultra marathon events a year now. So
wow.
A lot of them are within an hour's driving from my house. So almost any given weekend outside of the brutally hot summer months, I can basically show up to one of those races if I want to do one as kind of a training race or a good hard long run, and build up to a key event or event that I'm really trying to target.
Nice. And you said about there how you don't want to get out of that training run and then do junk miles for 2 weeks. How do you sort of know that you're semi-recovered, or that you're in a state where you've still got to train, but it's probably going to be more taxing than what it's worth?
Yeah, no, that's where I'll take some credit for being very well advanced in terms of knowing how my body operates. What I tell folks sometimes, especially if they're curious about my approach, is I let them know, I'm like, well, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a nutritionist. So, a lot of this stuff that I'm doing is stuff that I've worked through myself, asked a lot of questions of other people, leaned on a lot of experts, and kind of fine-tuned things for me personally. So where I can offer value, I think, in a more professional capacity is, I really know my body very well at this point. If you look at just like the last 10 years, I've run about 50,000 miles in training and racing. So for me, like, I've gone through that ups and downs of a training cycle. I've gotten a really good idea of when I'm like tired from just not quite sleeping enough, or if I'm tired and sore from doing a workout that was a little too hard. And you get to learn, like, you can really tell when you're like 100% versus maybe like 99%, if that makes sense, just from the number of reps you've done going through it. So after a big race like that, or not a big race, but a training race like that, I've gotten pretty good at kind of knowing during it and after it, like how much like damage essentially I've done and how much recovery is going to be needed to kind of bounce back from that and ultimately get stronger from it. And, usually what I'll do then is maybe that next morning I'll go out for a light jog and just kind of assess kind of how my body's feeling, what's tight, if anything's a little more sore than anything else, than other things, and then kind of start progress from there. For me, the nutrition side of things is really important in those type of setups, just because one thing I've noticed is if I'm going to do, even if it's a B race, it's still a pretty big effort relative to what I would be doing in a normal situation. Like if I go to like a 50-kilometer race and push at 80% capacity, that's a good hard effort. That's harder than I would probably push if I just went out for a 50-kilometer training run. So, for me, like after I finish that, I'm usually pretty diligent about my nutrition and like what I'm going to eat that next day or two to make sure I bounce back from that really quickly and can get back to training. And some of that's just been trial and error in the past, seeing what's worked and what hasn't, like what makes me feel good the next day and what makes me feel, like not training.
My mate Luke Taylor, who sort of trains for triathlon around somewhere between Olympic, half Ironman, and even he's done an Ironman in the past. He sort of has a 5-minute rule of goes for a jog and sees how he feels after 5 minutes. We aim for 50K. What's your rule?
Yeah, no, that's a great approach. That's similar to what I do too. This is what I call it, and this is what I do with my coaching clients. Is I have a workout called we call it DOC. It stands for distance of choice.
Yeah.
It was actually something I picked up from my college coach, and really what it means is you need to be honest with yourself. So go out and start the run. And if after 5 minutes you feel like garbage, don't be afraid to bail on it. And if you feel good, you don't have to feel like you have to cut it short just for the sake of cutting it short. So it's really one of those things that you have to kind of get in tune with your body and be able to really assess kind of how you're feeling and then be honest with yourself. Because I know with endurance athletes, sometimes it's hard because if you tell yourself, if I'm programming for kind of a type A client and I say, all right, here's a 90-minute run today, some of them are going to do that 90-minute run no matter what. They don't care how they feel. They're going to do it because I told them to do it. Whereas if I put down DOC, it kind of leaves them a little bit more flexibility to not feel like they're, not meeting the goal or they're falling behind in the training plan, because part of the plan was them becoming in tune with their body, listening to their body, and taking the rest when they need it. So I really kind of like that approach, not necessarily putting yourself in a position where you're going to do more damage when you should be recovering.
And so in your sport, I think it's really important, not only in terms of longevity for the race, but longevity to get the amount of miles in and still be able to do something that you love year on year. So how do you sort of take an approach to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, because we've seen plenty of people come in and out of the endurance running world. And some folks end up a little worse for the wear, and then it seems like other folks are doing it for their entire life and they really enjoy it. And personally, I really like to run. Like I think I would run or train and do some sort of endurance type activity, regardless of whether I was competitive or not, or regardless of whether I was targeting a specific race. So that level of interest makes me want to kind of have that piece available to me in my life throughout the entirety of it, even when I'm old and not competitive any longer. So it's definitely in the back of my mind always to, be taking care of myself so that I don't find myself 50 years old and unable to run and be hobbling around. And I think there's a lot of things that play a role in that. And some of it's just being consistent with your training, not overreaching and kind of following this, what I like to call a micro stress process, where you stress your body just enough to elicit a response, but not so much that, you've buried yourself for a couple of days. That's one component. And then another one is just sleeping really well. Sleep is huge. I think it's maybe one of the more underrated variables to training, because people don't necessarily count it in their metrics because they're not doing anything when they're sleeping, which is the idea behind it, I guess. But that one's big for me. So I'm always pretty conscious of making sure I get enough rest at night. And then the other piece of that puzzle is nutrition. And that's the one that I've probably tinkered around with the most since I started doing endurance events.
Yeah, as someone who's got a 13-month-old, trying to go to the gym, it's definitely a hindrance at times. This morning I was keen to get there, and then got woken up half an hour early, and then I was like, this is make or break, and it was unfortunately break, so I was back to bed for an hour and a half. So let's dive into the nutrition. You sort of, for the most part, you're low carb, but then you sort of titrate carbs throughout what's an extreme period of time. And then one thing that you mentioned on Joe Rogan, which I thought was fascinating, and probably goes back to what Sean found with his blood test, is that his glucose was high. And you sort of said that at times at the end of a race, your glucose can be high, so maybe you don't necessarily want to add more in at the end of the race. Can you talk around that a little bit?
Yeah. It's, I'll notice that every once in a while if I do a big workout, and then I'll test my blood glucose, and, it gets spiked regardless of what nutrition plan I'm following. So it's not uncommon after a big session to have elevated blood glucose levels. And I mean, some of that's just because your body's mobilizing that glucose, and it doesn't necessarily ramp it down the second you stop. So like if I test myself 2 hours after, it's probably way back down again to almost a fasting level. But if you test it like within 5-10 minutes of finishing a workout or something like that, you can see it's a little spiked when, I think a lot of people think that's when it would be at its all-time lowest. So yeah, I don't necessarily shovel a bunch of carbs down after a big effort, like what you're going to see a lot of people do. They're trying to replace their glycogen stores via, carbo loading or reloading, I guess, in that situation. And I think that's one of the more liberating things about a high-fat, low-carb diet is it's not void of carbohydrate, but you get your body just so good at burning fat that, after an event like that, I'm not depleted from an energy standpoint, in the sense that, I don't have access to a fuel substrate that's going to be able to just let me do like regular day-to-day type activities. So really when I decide what to eat after something like that, and this has changed a bit too, and I'm playing around with some different things at the moment as well, but just this, the idea I always ask is, well, what's next? So if I do a big workout and it's in the point of training where I have another workout that afternoon, whether that be going to the gym to do some strength or just to do some easy miles or something like that, I might have some carbohydrates after a workout in the morning in that scenario, because my turnaround time is so short relative to what it would maybe be if I did a big workout and I'm not going to do another one until the following day's evening, where then I have plenty of time to let fat and protein be used to kind of restock some of those depleted glycogen levels. So that's just kind of the way I've viewed it. And it's not necessarily something that I feel like is a magic bullet for anyone doing the approach. It's just my own personal assessment when I go through these type of situations, kind of how do I feel the best with that next one. And more often than not for me personally, like when I have that situation with a quick turnaround on the workout, a little bit of carbohydrate after that big session in the early morning tends to make me feel a little more prepared for that afternoon session. Whereas if I'm going to have 24 to 36 hours of recovery, then it doesn't seem to make a big difference for me. Then I can bounce back and hit the next workout hard if I have that time frame between. And that's actually been a pretty interesting topic that Sean and I have done on our podcast a few times and talked about, because Sean follows essentially a zero carb diet with mainly ribeye. And the interesting thing, and one of the reasons we partnered up for a podcast, was because we both follow a similar diet or a similar approach to diet, but his workout goals or his performance goals are on the very opposite spectrum of mine. Mine is essentially as high of endurance as you can get in terms of duration, and his are these short bursts where for him 60 seconds is a long session, whereas for me 60 seconds is about as short of a session I'll do. So yeah, so it's like there's like kind of both ends of the spectrum there. And Sean clearly performs well at those high intensity type of sessions regardless of not taking in a carbohydrate source. And I think there's something there with the amount of time he has, because when you're doing something as intense as he is, the volume at which you do it is a lot smaller. Whereas when you're doing something as low intense as I am, you kind of have to do a lot of it in order to get the specifics to what you're training for. So my windows of time or my training volume is just much larger than his. His is much more intense, but then he's got that luxury of having like 23, 24 hours between sessions where, he might do just fine enough job restocking that glycogen store from just the extended rest period between. And then also it's probably not too common that he completely depletes his glycogen with any one session either. Like when you think about how hard you'd actually have to be working for 45 to 60 minutes in order to completely deplete your glycogen, it'd be pretty hard, because usually when you look at that from the context of my world, the endurance world, there's a reason people bonk, quote unquote, at mile 20 of a 26-mile marathon. It's because, well, that's about how long it takes them to deplete their glycogen levels. And then if they're very dependent on that, they have they don't have enough fuel substrate coming from something else to really keep the pace or the effort that they were going before, and they're forced to slow down or sometimes even kind of stumble and fall over. But yeah, so it's interesting. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah, us Kiwis are familiar with bonking. We unfortunately had a race walker when the Commonwealth Games were in Malaysia. He was out front going for gold, and yeah, just couldn't walk anymore, and he ended up falling over. It was tragic. And also in New Zealand, going back a little bit, you said about the long, when we talk about the longevity of the sport, ultra is not too unfamiliar to us Kiwis. There's plenty of musterers out there that go on runs in the hills. We've got things like Coast to Coast and the Kepler Challenge down near where I'm from in Fiordland. And then we had Lisa Tamati for a number of years doing ultra marathons, and she ran the length of the country and went to Moab a couple of times, and a fair bit of footage was taken of her, and she ended up with sort of leaky gut and really bad fatigue, adrenal fatigue, that sort of stuff, and I think has since moved away from the sport, although she's still involved with running. But when you're in the gym and you're also eating meat with plenty of glycine and leucine, how much of that is about making sure that you're bulletproof to continue on with what it is? I'm sure it's, for a lot of people, it's sort of the other end of the spectrum. It's he's done forever, and then he's doing stuff that's muscular. Talk us through why that is important for somebody that's doing so much length and time.
Yeah, that's probably one of the things I've learned the most about since starting Human Performance Outliers podcast is we've had a lot of the kind of authorities on protein come on, like Professor Stu Phillips. We just interviewed Professor Don Lehman as well, Dr. Jose Antonio, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon has come on, talked about protein, Dr. Ben Bickman. So we've had a whole a list of different protein experts, and every one of them that's come on has basically said, like, if you're not hitting at least the high end of the recommendations as an athlete, you're missing out. And it's that resonated with me a bit, because I've gone through, I would say most, especially since I've started ultra running, I've always probably erred on the side of caution in terms of getting enough protein in. I've rarely been at what I would consider a low protein type of person. I've tried it in the past and felt absolutely miserable, which is why I stopped doing it. But when having those guys come on and talk about that made a lot of sense, because I think in the endurance community, a lot of times people think like, oh, well, I'm not trying to build a lot of mass. I'm not trying to become, this 280-pound bodybuilder. I'm trying to be like lean and light but still strong and fast. And they look at protein as something that's going to make them bulk up or something like that. Or they even look at the gym as something that's going to make them bulk up. And that's just not really the case. And I think like when you're putting your body through the amount of just pounding and repetitive stress on your muscles and things like that, there's a lot of just muscle breakdown that's going to require the building blocks to kind of repair and fix it. So it's been really enlightening to kind of hear those guys talk to that and voice those concerns. And, the other side of that I find really interesting too, is just like the quality of protein. The question I've always had is like, especially when you get into the topic of like plant-based protein versus animal-based protein, and, animal-based protein, its bioavailability is much higher. Like you have to eat probably almost twice as much plant-based protein, minus maybe if you get some really well formulated like protein supplement shakes or something like that. But to me, it's always made sense in the sense that like, well, if our bodies are very efficient at utilizing protein from an animal-based product, then does that tell us something about our digestive system in terms of what is the ideal proteins? So, that's where I focus a lot of my effort with that on, is getting those high quality animal-based proteins at a relatively high level. I think it's pretty rare that I go below 150 grams of protein a day.
Yeah, it was some feedback I sort of got for myself last time we did an impedance. I'd done a really good job in building muscle mass up again. I hadn't trained fully at a gym setting for a long time and built this muscle mass, and then sort of 6 months went by and I'd lost it all, and probably enough, had a little bit of travel and got sick, and I was like, oh, here we go. Because I went through a period with an integrative practitioner, and that was exactly what he said. You've got to be, if you're doing all these things outside of the stress of your life, you've got to be up the upper end of the protein spectrum. And you talk about those bioavailability and other nutrients you get from meat. The collagen and the glycine and the leucine. It keeps your gut intact, and something that you guys are often talking about. And you have people like Georgia Eid on their the anti-nutrients that can actually break down that gut, and especially if you're in an environment where it's stressful on your joints, but also you're in a stress to your body. Something else that you don't want to have is this poor immune system and poor gut system, which could potentially bring things into your body that fire your immune system up. The gut's quite early in terms of its knowledge. How do you sort of think? Do you know that things are going to go downhill if you're not eating on point, or you feel like your gut's sort of a bit not there, or something along those lines?
Yeah. In terms of gut health and digestion, I'm much more interested in kind of how I feel than what we don't know about it yet. Because what we don't know. And I think the gut is something that is a very interesting topic, but we know way less about it than we do know about it in terms of what we're doing with it nutritionally. So for me, I'm looking at it from the lens of like, well, why would if my body doesn't feel right when I eat this, if this makes me bloat, if this makes me run to the bathroom 3 or 4 times a day, it's not working with my system for whatever reason. So why would I be putting it in there? So that's kind of where I've always drawn the line, is like, well, how do I get myself in a position where I'm never bloated? I don't feel any type of distress from eating foods. I don't feel like I have to rush to the bathroom a bunch of times a day. And I think most people, if they operated like that, they would find what does and doesn't work for them. But we've essentially normalized less than ideal situations. I think we've normalized that going to the bathroom multiple times a day is healthy, or having like these massive stools in the morning is healthy. And it's like, I don't know where that actually came from, but for me, it's like, if I eat stuff and I feel good and I feel like I'm not bloated, I feel like my energy levels are high, and I don't feel like I have to rush to the bathroom a bunch of times, then I'm eating what my body is meant to eat. And I think it's as simple as that in terms of what we know at the moment. I also think really looked at diet through a singular lens in a lot of cases, where we say, oh, you need X amount of this. And that's probably true if the person's following a standard American diet or a more typical food pyramid type of a diet. Then yeah, you probably do want to get X amount of fiber, or you do want to get X amount of this, that, and the other thing. But these studies and these things where they're not looking at people who are doing something different in their nutrition, they're not looking at that. There's not a lot of data on that stuff. So to some degree, I think the best nutrition experiment you can do is do it yourself. And I think a meat-based start is a great way to kind of clean that slate. I think what we do know is that at the very least, it's kind of like a fasting mimic to a degree, which is going to allow your body to kind of do like an ultimate assessment of what does and doesn't work with. I think someone doing an elimination diet is going to be doing themselves a bit more of a favor if they do a fatty meat-based elimination diet, because then they're eliminating any potential trigger. And then if they do want to try to bring back some other foods, they can try them out one by one and get a real clean answer as to whether it's going to respond well to them or not. But yeah, I guess, without being an expert in it, that's just kind of where I've fallen. And, and part of that's just because like you can find quote unquote evidence to basically any nutritional program. You can find people that say, well, you can just like micronutrients don't matter. You can eat whatever you want as long as you eat in the right quantities and stuff like that. And, you can find people which point to research that shows, raw vegetable diet only is going to be the best, most optimal health. Then you find people that will say all animal based and then everything in between. So, there's just really no good, clean consensus in my opinion as to what that is. So where that leaves me is to try to figure it out for myself. And that's essentially what I've done. You keep an open mind, keep an open ear, and, don't dismiss anything right out the gate, but, also, take your own experiences as evidence as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite funny. It's not the first time that we've ended up going to the toilet with a conversation. And I guess that's when you take a full holistic approach to things. It's not just what goes in, it's what comes out and how it makes you feel. And of course, being in an endurance where you're under stress and your sympathetic nervous system's going for a long time, you don't want that, like I said, you don't want to be going 2 or 3 times a day if you're going to be running for a whole day.
Right. Yeah. Limit the stops.
Yeah, that's right. So what do you have to do about that in a race?
It depends on the event, really. Like some of these, there's such a ultra marathon is kind of under one umbrella, but really there's events that couldn't be any more different from one another. You might have like a 50K race that goes up steep mountains to 10, 11,000 feet. Then you might have like a 6-day event where you see how far you can run in 6 days. That's on a quarter-mile loop. Yeah. So, I mean, the quarter-mile loop ones, they're monotonous and boring, but there's a porta potty there. So if you got to go to the bathroom, it's pretty easy. The trail wilderness one is a little less likely you're going to find yourself in an actual bathroom. And, most people get good at pooping in the woods in those situations.
On that, you and is she your wife now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you guys came out to New Zealand and ran the Tarawera. And Courtney Dualda was there as well. Is that right?
Yeah, we weren't out there for the race. We were out there about a month and a half before that. So we've never done Tarawera yet, but I think it's probably one that we'll try to get to eventually, especially after seeing New Zealand and knowing for a fact we want to be back at some point. So it would make sense to hit that up on the way. But yeah, I think Courtney ran the 100K this year and won it. And she's just been a rock star on all accounts within the world of ultramarathon running the last couple of years.
And so then what did you guys get up to in New Zealand?
Yeah, so we did what I would say a pretty well exhausted tour of the Northern Island. Yeah. We are planning on going to check out the Southern Island at a separate time. We were just looking at it when we first decided to go, and we're like, If we were going to check out both islands in a way that we felt good about, we'd have to be here for 3 to 4 weeks. So we were like, let's pick one of them and just see everything there is to see, and then come back and do the other one down the road. So we stuck to mostly the northern half of the northern island, but we got up pretty much everywhere up there. So it was really cool to see how much variance there is in the different topography in a relatively small geographical area. So, you get down into kind of the middle of that northern island, and you just have these really awesome trails and mountains, and even some like kind of more what we would consider like a pine woodland over here in the US. And then you head up even further north on that, and you can almost hop from one side of the coast to the other side pretty easily and see the difference there. So we felt really spoiled for a couple of weeks.
And when you do make it to the South Island, it's completely different again. That's where the Alpine starts to come in, and
yeah. Yeah, we were a little hesitant to do the northern island first, because we both, I think, would probably prefer the southern island if we had to pick one. But we were also coming in at the end of a race season, so it was a little less, we weren't as maybe physically active as we would like to be to explore the South Island. I think we want to go to the South Island with a pair of fresh legs and just go crazy on all the trails out there. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to do that one second.
Nice. And do you have any plans to go to Europe? And is it Mount Blanc? I've watched a Red Bull video of that race, and just
Ultra Trail Mont Blanc. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My wife's done that race once already. I want to say in 2015, and she said it's beautiful. It's one of the best spots, and I say that without being there.
Yeah.
But I would say UTMB is not necessarily the type of course I've historically really targeted. And, part of that's just because most of my life I've lived in really flat areas of the country. So my access to real steep technical terrain has been very limited, if not basically non-existent. So the history for me in the sport has been targeting more runnable courses. So I have to kind of get my head around preparing for something like that and really give it a good go at some point, because I would love to see that one. It seems like it's getting to be such a big event that it would be a shame not to do it at least once, even if it isn't necessarily an ideal situation. Because it's hard to argue at this point that it's not the most competitive 100-miler in the world. Western States is probably the next one that would be considered right up there next to it. But UTMB's grown quite a bit the last few years, and it's about as competitive as they get at the 100-mile distance. Nice.
So talk to me about the pain level. You said on a B race you're sort of going at 80%, and I suppose is that perceived exertion? Do you think? Yeah. What sort of pain are you doing for 100 miles? Where does that go?
It's really interesting. I think it's actually one of the more interesting parts of the sport, because most sports you can get pretty close to mimicking game day or like event day conditions or the way you're going to feel, because they're short enough where you might even do like a harder workout. Whereas there's really no way to mimic miles 80 to 100 in a 100-miler without actually doing it. So, but it is different. Like it's, I would say you get maybe 30, 40 miles in, and that's kind of when I'll start to notice like, all right, I don't feel like I'm shot out of a cannon anymore. Like I'm starting to feel the wear and tear a bit from the race. And at that point, it doesn't really get a whole lot worse. But what ends up happening, at least this is my perception, is that in those early stages, like any kind of negative doubt that creeps in your mind is pretty rare. And it's really easy just to dismiss it. The further you get, the more frequent those negative thoughts kind of become. And you find yourself just getting this like kind of constant barrage of, why am I out here? Why am I doing this? My leg hurts, I should stop, that sort of thing. And it's just like a constant ringing in your mind. And you're just as soon as you kind of push it down and keep moving forward, it pops back up. So the increased in frequency of kind of those negative thoughts actually makes time feel like it's going a lot slower. because like you relate it to how infrequent those were in the early stages, which is why I personally think the early stages go by so much faster because your mind is fresh. It's easy to kind of fight that stuff back. So I really think it's more of a mental fatigue than it is a physical fatigue, because like, the pace at the back end of 100 miler or at any point in 100 mile is a pace that like is very sustainable for, most of the people doing it when they're just out there doing their normal workouts and stuff. So there's really nothing about the actual physical, the physical capability of being able to kind of push a little harder at the end of a race that I can think of that would be make it undoable. But there's very much kind of that mental fatigue and then that just motivation dip and stuff just from being out there for that long.
And so when you're pacing, your record is somewhere around 7 minutes a mile. When you're pacing, is that a consistent pacing, or do you sort of break it up into sections and go harder at points in time? How does that how do you pace it?
Yeah. There's a little bit of I debate, I guess, as to what the best way to execute an ultra marathon is in terms of like a negative split or a positive split or an even split. I think, if you look at just endurance records in general, not ultra marathon ones, it's pretty difficult to find even or negative split world records. Like usually it's a slight positive split is kind of indicative that the person kind of met their full potential because they slowed down a little bit, which shows they got every little bit out of themselves, but they didn't slow down so much where they were giving back twice as much as they gained by going out as fast as they did. So I try to look at it a little bit from that lens. I favor a positive split because I just know like running is going to feel easier in the beginning from a mental standpoint. So to kind of force myself to go slower is going to be kind of passing up on an opportunity to, I don't want to say bank time or bank miles, because that's maybe the wrong way to look at it, because there's definitely like a fine line that you can cross over. And I've certainly done that where you go a little too fast and you end up giving back way more at the end than you should have. But if you go out with a slight positive split, I think that's the move. And that's usually how I strategize a pacing plan. I kind of come up with what time I'm targeting. If it's an event where, time is kind of the goal, and then just try to do the first half a little bit faster than what I want my average pace to end up being. It gets a little more interesting when you get into some of these trail mountain ultra marathons, just because the variables can fluctuate quite a bit. Some years at the Western States 100, you might have 10 miles worth of snow cover in the high country if it's a snowy winter. And if you have a dry winter, it might be really flat, fast, hard-packed trails, not a lot of ruts out there. And, you're going to be able to run faster, or weather too. Like, the coldest year on record at Western States, it peaked at like, I think in the 70s in the canyons. And then the hottest year on record, it was like into the 110s Fahrenheit in the canyons. So like when you're dealing with those big swings and variables, you have to kind of adjust your race pace strategy and kind of take things as they come a little more.
And is that, which do you prefer? Obviously with a road or a track, you can be a lot more methodical, and probably with that it brings stress to, am I on track or not? But when it comes to a trail, there's obviously that excitement value of this, like I say, so many variables and so many different things influencing the pace that you're at, the speed you're breathing, how much oxygen you're getting, all those sorts of things. What that's probably a hard question to answer, which do you prefer, but what do you reckon?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's, what I say is like there's pros and cons to both of them from an execution standpoint, and they are opposite of one another. So you think of a track and it's like about as boring and a monotonous place as you can do an ultra marathon. So that's the con. And then, but logistically as easy as it gets. Like you could have one person out there to help you out, and you have everything you want every 400 meters if you want it. So there's that, plus there's the just knowledge of this terrain is going to be this the whole way. So I know what I'm getting into. I can see the entire course the entire time. A lot of times those timed events tend to be a little more controlled with the weather. They're just planned around times of year where the weather tends to be a little better. Because more or less they're structured for fast times. So they're going to try to build it around a way to manage those variables a little more consistently. And then you go to the trails and it's like, you get these super beautiful, like fun to be in environments, but then there's a lot of uncertainty too. Like, knowing how far each aid station is spaced and deciding how much water do I need to bring, or, trying to carry enough that you don't get behind in hydration and fueling, but not so much that you're carrying an extra like pound or two of water that you don't need to be carrying and things like that. And then, that's a whole nother variable in of itself. Most trail races, you're going to be carrying some stuff. Whereas like you do a track or a short loop, you can grab that bottle of water and drink it and then ditch it and not touch it again until you need it again. So it's a little more freeing in that you're just kind of like, shoes, shorts, and a singlet on the track and not really have to worry about anything else. But on the trails, you might need a pack, you might need, all sorts of other stuff to kind of just make sure you're getting from one spot to the other without falling apart.
Nice. And so the sustainability through the race, on your podcast, you talk about the green tea extract, and then what do you do for electrolytes? How does that all sort of mix it, and how do you make it ultra concentrated, or is that too much of a burden, or like, what do you do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The tea's called yerba mate, and I actually came across that, I want to say back in maybe 2015, 2014, 2015. And it was interesting to me because I've been a coffee drinker for at least about a decade. So, that's always kind of been in my routine more or less. And when I started using yerba mate, what I noticed was it was just like, you could tell there was caffeine in it, but it just behaved differently. So like you drink a cup of coffee, you kind of get this like excited, like I'm shot out of a cannon type of feeling. It just really jumpstarts you. Whereas the yerba mate is like what I would describe as more of like a calm sense of energy. You feel kind of like you have the energy you need, but it doesn't cause you to kind of throttle down harder than what you maybe should. And I like that because I think it kind of gives you a little more of a focus as opposed to a jittery feeling. So that's kind of where I gravitated towards that at first. And then one of our guests on the podcast, Dr. Ben Bickman, he's come on a couple times now, and he's been doing some research on yerba mate with I think it's like mitochondria or something like that. So he's been kind of interested in that. So that's kind of re-sparked the interest in in that with me, just because like now there's like maybe some science behind it too, as opposed to just me like using it because I like the way I feel when I have it. And then with electrolytes and stuff, I'll do a few different things. One product I've used quite a bit is this product called Hydro X by a company named X Endurance. It's just like a little powder with electrolytes, and you can just, put that inside whatever water bottle you're doing. So I'll do that more or less depending on the weather. If it's a really hot day, I'm going to be doing a little more of it. If it's relatively cool or downright cold, I won't do nearly as much electrolytes. That's kind of where I do with that. And the concentrate stuff, I've done that in the past when it's like a logistical issue where I'm going to be going a long ways and not necessarily have access to the fuel that I want. I'll make a concentrate and then just kind of have plain water that I can drink following a tiny little squirt of whatever the concentrate is. Most places now events now are set up with all the bells and whistles you could imagine. So you're never really going too far before going through an aid station. So it's pretty rare that I have to pack a whole lot of stuff in the events I've been doing anyway.
Nice. And on this podcast, we've talked a little bit about brain injury, and we've had Michael Lewis on here, and he talks about CBD, but I heard you use CBD for a different reason. Also, it's one of the reasons why it helps with brain injury is that lowering of inflammation. What's your experience, mate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't necessarily say that I've had anything that would be profound turnaround. I guess maybe I just haven't been dinged up bad enough to really see a big, which I guess I should be thankful for. That's one other thing I've had work for me since starting ultra running. I've really only had one significant injury, and it was I had a stress fracture on my left sacral ala. and that put me down for about 7 weeks. So that was like pretty much the only thing that's had me had to take more than a couple days off. But like, as far as like minor aches and pains and stuff like that, I think the CBD oil can be good for that, especially when you're trying to kind of build up and peak for like a race, and you're gonna have to go out and do some work when you're not feeling quite as right, or you're having a few aches and pains. And my wife actually used some of it on her foot. She had a nasty case of plantar fasciitis at the middle of last year that she had to take off a few weeks, and then ultimately started running again, but was just had to manage it for like a few months after that. And she said that seemed to help a little bit, kind of loosen it up in the morning when it was its tightest.
So there's, again, open debate about when you're trying to be an elite, do you be fully all in into one thing and there's no balance to the life, or, especially with running a long distance, how do you balance out that huge intensity, that huge sympathetic demand, and then unwind and also relax the muscles, stop them.
Yeah.
I don't know if you sit there and your quads and hamstrings pulse or not, but what do you do to unwind it all?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's where I find it really fascinating is just like, the stress component and the building process. So I've been doing endurance sports now at a higher volume capacity for quite a while. So, the amount of recovery I need, I guess, or the amount of unwinding I need for a pretty big stimulus is a lot lower than it would have been in the past when I was first starting, or for someone who's doing it for the first time, where, they might do a training cycle that is like a third the size of mine and be more worn down than I would be, just because they haven't, done it for a decade. So I think sometimes it's a little hard to comprehend when you're not in the exact same position as the person you're comparing to, because of that like past experience side of things. But in terms of unwinding and stuff, I guess maybe it's just my personality, but I generally like to be doing stuff. So, I've never been the type of person who would want to be just only an athlete. I would be just thinking about that, or probably ended up training too much, making more mistakes by having that type of flexibility. So, that's part of the reason why I try to stay busy with other things like helping out Ultra Footwear, and then doing some coaching, and then the podcast, that's ends up being enough stuff to kind of keep my mind off of training and running when I should be focusing on something else. But, I definitely like to relax at the end of the day, watch some TV or something like that. And I don't generally stay up super late, because I think the one thing you should just be, we talked about a bit earlier, is that sleep component. And I think like getting to bed at a decent hour so that you definitely do get that sleep is a really important thing to consider. And I sleep really well, and maybe I'm lucky with that. I don't know. But part of that, I think, lets me go really hard for the other 15, 16 hours of the day.
Listen, if anybody wants to shoot that off, have a listen to Matthew Walker on any of the podcasts he's been on. It'll be enough to get you to buy some hue lights and black out your curtains and everything.
Yeah. Well, that does make a difference. I know, like, yeah, I'll wake up to the sun if I leave the curtains open. And, usually that's fine, because usually, minus like the summer months when there's just not that much darkness, usually I'm in bed early enough where if the sun's coming up, I should be up by then anyway. But if I'm in a situation where I'm staying up later for whatever reason, those blackout curtains, they make a big difference. I can sleep right through the sunrise when those things are there. But yes, sleep quality is huge. That's one of the reasons why I initially switched to a high-fat, low-carb diet, because my entire life I had been a really good sleeper through college, like routinely 8 to 9 hours a night. Would rarely wake up, maybe once to go to the bathroom if I had hydrated a bunch after dinner or something like that. And then after college, when I was teaching, I started to notice that was changing. I was waking up 4 or 5 times a night to go to the bathroom. And when I'd wake up, it would take me 20, 30 minutes to fall back asleep. And I found myself blocking off like huge chunks of time to sleep, just to make sure I get enough. So instead of going to bed at 10, knowing I'd wake up at about 6:30 and get 8.5 hours of sleep, I'd like go to bed at, 8:30 because I knew I was going to need a 10 and a half, 11 hour block of time to make sure I got 8, 9 hours of sleep. And that just didn't make sense to me in the context that I had historically been a good sleeper. And it didn't make sense to me in the context that I was in my mid-20s and I should have been as, healthy as you can be. So that's when I actually first started looking into like nutrition and how that can maybe affect sleep and affect other things. And that was one of the first things that cleared up when I switched to a high fat, low carb diet, was I started sleeping through the night pretty consistently again after that. So whether you use the blue blocker glasses, the curtains, everything, it's all plays a role, but get the good sleep if you can.
Yeah, no, and interesting you brought up the fact that the low carb diet helped with your sleep. Through uni, I was on a roller coaster, and that was probably not enough sleep, caffeine fueled days, and high carbohydrate intake. And then again after uni, I was sort of like, oh, this has got to change. And when you're trying to work, you can't have a nap in the middle of the afternoon. And one of the things I noticed is that snoring pretty much disappeared. And then there's something that you hear so often is, I don't snore anymore now. I don't have so many carbs, and you wonder where that comes from. Is it mucous membrane inflammation in the nose or what? But yeah, just being in a better sleep cycle, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
Mate, where do people find you? Like you mentioned a few things there. You do some coaching, and I've talked to somebody in the States who's done a little bit of work with you. Where do people find you? The podcast is absolutely awesome. Saw you guys broke 1 million. Was that right the other day?
Yeah, we had our 1,000th download. That was a pretty cool spot to hit. So yeah, we've been excited about that. In terms of where you can find me, like the most direct spot to all my spots is probably my website, just ZachBitter, ZachBitter.com. From there, you can link to my Instagram and Twitter and all those other places, HPO podcast. I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram in terms of social media. So definitely shoot me a note if you want. I am starting a new YouTube. Well, it's not new. I've had it for a while, but I just never used it. A new YouTube channel where I'm going to start putting up just answers to questions I get on a more frequent basis. Because, I'll get questions coming in on Instagram, Twitter, through my contact submission form on my website. And sometimes I'll be typing out an answer on my phone. I'm thinking, I could probably say this a lot better if I could just tell them this instead of trying to thumb it out on the phone. So like when I get a good enough question or a recurring question, I think I'm just going to start recording an answer to it. And then just when it gets asked again, I can point them to a higher quality response to it on that. So if you do have questions that you think would fit that, send them my way and I'll start populating that a bit too. I think there's only 2 up there right now. One on like max heart rate testing, and another one on how to start a high fat, low carb diet when you're doing endurance work. So feel free to nudge me along in adding to that.
Absolutely. And the more feedback you get, the more impassioned you get about it. So
no doubt.
Everyone can find those in the show notes. I'll put the actual link there. So all you need to do is click on it and it'll take you straight to whichever page you want to go. And what do people have to look forward to? You said you've got 2 good races coming up.
Yeah, I got one coming up here in April called the Whiskey Basin 88K. It's kind of a local fun trail race out here in Arizona. And then I'm most likely going to head out to Philadelphia in May, second weekend in May, to do a 24-hour out there called Dawn to Dusk to Dawn. So it's kind of my immediate race plans right now.
Fantastic. So what's a sort of a mindset that you'd like to leave people with, or something to sort of sum up how you've attacked life so far?
Yeah, I think like one thing I usually like to tell folks is don't feel like you have to do everything all at once. I mean, it's so easy nowadays to like just look at, what other people are doing and be like, wow, they've got this unique diet that's working so well for them. They've got this awesome training plan. They're where I want to be, or I want to get to that. I want to do that. And it's easy to forget how many mistakes they made along the way to get to that, how much time they spent doing it. So like, there's no shame in building up slowly and in a meaningful, sustainable way. So like, pick and choose those battles and be proud of yourself for accomplishing some of the small steps that it takes to get to some of those big goals. I always hate to see someone have a big goal and end up not getting to it because they focus just on the end of that instead of like all the cool little things that they could have experienced along the way. So I guess in short, enjoy the process as much as the end result, and you'll probably find yourself more fulfilled with it.
Powerful, man. And yeah, like you said, the little steps are actually what got the person to where they are right now, and you haven't experienced that if you're just looking at where they are right now.
No doubt. Enjoy the small steps.
This has been absolutely awesome, and I'm glad that I got you on to the podcast after having Sean on last year, and I'm an absolute fan of what you guys do. Plenty of the names you brought up there have been, hugely awesome resources for myself, and yeah, just keep on doing what you're doing and keep being an outlier. It's awesome to see.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me on. I first got interested in doing a podcast myself by going on podcasts and being on this end of the spectrum. And since starting the HBO podcast, I feel like I haven't done as good a job of making the podcast rounds. And part of that's probably just because I'm dedicating some of that time to recording and stuff. But it's always good to be reminded that it's fun to be the guest.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Have a good day. We'll leave it there, and cheers.
Take care.